think it started with our turnovers. And we had 9 turnovers. They had 11 points off of those turnovers. It's hard for us to recover.
Stephanie White just walked up to a live microphone, looked directly into the cameras, and blamed Caitlin Clark for the Indiana Fever's loss. Not the rotations, not the blown double-digit lead, not the second-half collapse that nobody on this coaching staff can explain. Caitlin Clark, the player who was scoring in the third quarter when Stephanie White decided to scold her on the sideline. That Caitlin Clark. This is Rim Run, and today we are documenting the exact moment a head coach chose her own ego over her franchise player and then lied about it to the entire world on camera.
Yeah, I think just got to take care of the ball better, and that starts with me. So I think just focusing on that, and then...
You see that? Got to take the ball care of...
Let me be entirely clear about what is at stake here before we go any further. This is not a disagreement about basketball philosophy. This is not a debate about offensive schemes or defensive rotations. This is a head coach who had a double-digit lead, watched it evaporate into a near 20-point loss, walked to the post-game podium, and handed the blame to the one person on that roster who cannot publicly fight back. That is the story. That is the only story. And the reason it matters beyond one game, beyond one loss, beyond one ugly post-game press conference, is because this is a pattern. This is a documented, undeniable, catastrophic pattern of behavior that has been playing out in Indiana all season long. Caitlin Clark is carrying this franchise on her back while the person who is supposed to be her head coach is actively working against her every single game. And the people who run this team have watched it happen and said absolutely nothing. That silence is its own brutal indictment. Let's get into the evidence because the evidence is overwhelming.
Yeah, there are only so many schemes you can do. So I think for us, it's just being more intentional and having a higher discipline level when we're in those.
Here is what actually happened in that game. The Indiana Fever had a double-digit lead. Caitlin Clark was playing well. She was getting to the paint. She was finding open people. She was doing exactly what you want your best player to do when the game is there for the taking. And then the third quarter started, and Caitlin Clark scored a basket. She made a basket, she put the ball in the net, and what did Stephanie White do in response to her best player scoring? She scolded her, on the sideline, in front of her teammates. Stephanie White stood there and berated Caitlin Clark for making a basket. Think about that for 1 second. Really sit with that. Your team is winning, your best player just scored, and your head coach's response is to pull her aside and scold her. Not to celebrate the bucket, not to encourage the momentum, to scold her. And what happened immediately after that moment? Caitlin Clark went on to commit 5 turnovers in that quarter. 5 in one quarter. And the people who want to use those turnovers as ammunition against Caitlin Clark need to understand something fundamental. The mental spiral that produced those turnovers was triggered by the head coach who was supposed to prevent exactly that kind of collapse. Stephanie White lit the fuse. Then she blamed Caitlin Clark for the explosion. This is not speculation. This is not a hot take. This is the sequence of events as they occurred, in order, on camera. And it gets worse, because after the Fever blew that lead, after the Atlanta Dream ran away with a game Indiana had no business losing, after all of those catastrophic second-half decisions, Stephanie White did what Stephanie White always does. She went to the podium, and she opened her mouth. And what came out of that mouth was not accountability. It was not self-reflection. It was not even a half-hearted attempt to acknowledge her own role in the collapse. Don't take my word for it. Here is exactly what she said, in her own words, with cameras rolling.
I think it started with our turnovers. And we had 9 turnovers. They had 11 points off of those turnovers. It's hard for us to recover.
She said it, with cameras rolling. After blowing a double-digit lead, after the rotations fell apart, after everything we just described, Stephanie White stood at that podium and said the turnovers were why they lost. The turnovers, not the coaching, the turnovers. Let me say that back to you one more time so it lands the way it deserves to land. Stephanie White had 9 turnovers. Atlanta had 11 points off those turnovers. And Stephanie White presented that as the reason the Indiana Fever lost a game they were winning by double digits. That is the admission. That is the deflection on camera. That is Stephanie White refusing in real time to account for a single decision she made. Now let us talk about what the numbers actually say, because the numbers absolutely destroy this narrative. The Atlanta Dream had 3 more points off turnovers than the Indiana Fever did. 3. That is the margin Stephanie White is using to explain away a near 20-point loss. 3 points off turnovers. You had a double-digit lead. You lost by nearly 20. And you are standing at a podium pointing at a 3-point differential in turnover points as the explanation for a catastrophic, soul-crushing collapse. That is not analysis. That is not accountability. That is a head coach desperately searching for anywhere to point that is not the mirror. And here is the part that should make every single Fever fan absolutely furious. Stephanie White is not doing this by accident. This is not a coach who is confused or overwhelmed or just struggling to find the right words in a difficult moment. This is a deliberate, calculated pattern of behavior. Every time this team loses a game it should have won, Stephanie White finds a way to make sure the narrative lands on Caitlin Clark. Every single time. The turnovers, the disconnection in the third quarter, the inability to regroup. It is always framed in a way that implicates the player, never the coach. And Caitlin Clark cannot fight back. She cannot stand at her own podium and say what everyone watching already knows. There is already a relentless smear campaign running against her in this league. If she shows any frustration, if she expresses any dissatisfaction, the same people who are silent about Stephanie White's accountability failures will be screaming about Caitlin Clark's attitude within 24 hours. So she absorbs it. Every time, she walks to the mic and she takes the blame. And Stephanie White counts on that. Stephanie White has built her entire accountability avoidance strategy around the fact that Caitlin Clark is too professional to publicly expose her. Let us talk about the tactical failure in this specific game, because the coaching decisions were not just bad, they were baffling. The Fever were playing well in transition in the first half. Caitlin Clark was finding open people, the offense was flowing, and Indiana had the lead. Then the third quarter happened, and Stephanie White's halftime adjustments, or lack thereof, became catastrophic. When Atlanta went on their run in the third, Indiana had no answer. No defensive adjustment, no offensive counter, nothing. And rather than lean into what was working, rather than keep Caitlin Clark in attack mode, Stephanie White chose to publicly dress her down on the sideline and then redirect the offense through other players. The result was a complete second-half implosion. And then there is the rotation issue, which is its own separate catastrophe. Stephanie White subbed in Ty Harris, a player who had not played the entire game up to that point. Think about the logic of that decision. You are in the middle of a collapse. You need your best players on the floor making plays, and your answer is to insert a player who has been cold on the bench for the entire game. That is not a coaching adjustment. That is a coin flip. That is a head coach who has run out of ideas and is throwing bodies at the problem and hoping something sticks. It did not stick. The collapse continued, and then Stephanie White went to the podium and blamed the turnovers.
Yeah, I mean, I think just got to take care of the ball better, and that starts with me. So I think just focusing on that, and then...
You see that? Got to take the ball care of...
Now let us talk about the pattern. Because this is not an isolated incident. This is who Stephanie White is as a head coach, and the evidence has been accumulating all season. The roster construction is a disaster that Stephanie White has failed to address. You have players getting meaningful minutes who are, by any honest assessment, unplayable at this level. Michaela Timpson, unplayable. Ty Harris, unplayable. Raven Johnson playing far too many minutes. These are not players who are going to help you win games against playoff-caliber competition. And yet they are getting court time, while Caitlin Clark is being asked to carry the offensive load with one hand tied behind her back. And then there is the Kelsey Mitchell situation, which deserves its own conversation. Because Kelsey Mitchell, when she is locked in and moving the ball, is a legitimate offensive weapon. But there are stretches in these games where the ball stops moving through Caitlin Clark entirely, where the offense runs through Kelsey Mitchell in isolation situations that are not generating good shots, and the Fever hemorrhage momentum. Caitlin Clark was on a heater in the first half of this game. She was in attack mode, she was getting downhill, she was finding open shooters, and the offense was humming. And then the second half started, and the transition game disappeared entirely, because the fouls were piling up and the offense stalled. And Stephanie White's response was to run the same sets that were not working, rather than make any meaningful adjustment. This is the part of the story that the establishment does not want to have an honest conversation about. Because if you have a genuinely honest conversation about what is happening in Indiana, you have to reckon with the fact that Stephanie White is actively limiting what Caitlin Clark can do, not through malice necessarily, but through incompetence, through a stubborn refusal to adapt, through a rotation system that makes no sense, through a habit of publicly undermining her best player when things go wrong, instead of shielding her and taking the heat herself the way great coaches do. Great coaches protect their players. Great coaches walk to the podium after a loss and say the failures were on them. Great coaches do not stand in front of cameras and point at the turnover column and say that is why we lost, when their own team was winning before the coaching decisions fell apart. Stephanie White has not demonstrated the capacity to be that kind of coach. Not once this season. Not in any game where accountability was required. And the people who run the Indiana Fever have watched this happen and have not made a move. That is not just Stephanie White's failure. That is an organizational failure. That is a front office that is either not watching the games or is watching them and has decided that this situation is acceptable. Neither explanation is flattering. And while all of this is happening, while Stephanie White is deflecting and the front office is silent and the roster is being mismanaged, Caitlin Clark is going to the podium and doing the one thing nobody on that coaching staff has the courage to do. She is taking responsibility. She is standing in front of the cameras and saying the ball handling has to be better, and that starts with her. Even when 3 of those turnovers in the third quarter were her teammates' turnovers, even when the mental spiral that produced those turnovers was triggered by her own head coach's sideline behavior, she still walks up there and says it falls on her. That is not a player who does not care. That is not a player who is not a leader. That is a player who has more class and more accountability in one press conference than her head coach has shown all season. And here is what Caitlin Clark said when the cameras were on her. Watch this.
Yeah, I mean, there are only so many schemes you can do. So I think for us, it's just being more intentional and having a higher discipline level when we're in those.
She said it falls on her. She said taking care of the ball starts with her. After a game where multiple turnovers belong to her teammates, after a game where her head coach publicly scolded her for scoring, after a game where the coaching decisions in the second half were indefensible, Caitlin Clark stood at that microphone and pointed the finger directly at herself. That is the contrast that nobody in the mainstream basketball conversation wants to sit with. The head coach deflects, the player accepts, the head coach points at the turnover column. The player says it starts with me. The head coach walks away clean. The player absorbs the entire narrative, every single game. That is the reality of what is happening in Indiana right now, and it is absolutely brutal to watch. Let me talk about what this is costing Caitlin Clark specifically, because the cost is real and it is escalating. Every game that Stephanie White mismanages is a game where Caitlin Clark's statistical narrative gets muddied. Every blown lead is a data point that the people who want to diminish her will use. Every turnover that gets highlighted in a post-game press conference, whether it was hers or not, becomes part of the story that gets told about her. And Caitlin Clark has no recourse. She cannot publicly call out the coaching. She cannot say what is obvious to anyone watching the games. The smear infrastructure is already in place and waiting. The moment she shows any frustration publicly, the moment she says anything that could be framed as disrespectful to the coaching staff, the narrative machine activates and she becomes the problem. So she keeps absorbing it. She keeps walking to the podium and taking the blame. And Stephanie White keeps walking away clean. And what makes this genuinely infuriating, what makes this the conversation that the establishment refuses to have, is that the fix is not complicated. The fix is not some elaborate roster reconstruction or some multi-year rebuilding project. The fix is a head coach who protects her best player, makes halftime adjustments that reflect what she is seeing on the floor, and walks to the post-game podium with enough accountability to say when the losses are on her. That is it. That is the baseline. And Stephanie White cannot clear that bar. She has not cleared it once this season. And after what happened in this game, after the scolding on the sideline and the second half collapse and the podium deflection, it is impossible to look at this situation and believe that anything is going to change under the current coaching staff. Now let us talk about the defensive scheme conversation, because this is where Stephanie White's limitations become completely undeniable. When she was asked at the podium about the foul trouble situation, about whether there were adjustments she could make defensively to account for how the game is being called, her answer was essentially that there are only so many schemes you can run. She said it, with cameras rolling. A reporter asked her directly whether she could scheme differently given the way fouls were being called. And the head coach of the Indiana Fever said there are only so many schemes you can do. That is a head coach telling you in plain language that she has no answer, that she has reached the ceiling of her tactical repertoire, that whatever you are seeing on the floor is the best she has. No zone, no meaningful variation, no creative adjustment. This is what we have. Take it or leave it. There are only so many schemes you can do. That is the head coach of the Indiana Fever. That is her answer to a direct question about whether she can make defensive adjustments. There are only so many schemes. Let that land for a second. Every elite coaching staff in this league has a deep playbook of defensive looks, zone packages, switching schemes, trapping schemes, adjustments based on personnel and foul trouble and game situation, and Stephanie White sat at that podium and essentially told the world that she has exhausted her options. She is out of answers. She is running the same defensive scheme regardless of what the opposing offense is doing to it, and when it does not work, she is going to point at the turnover column and say that is why they lost. That is not a head coach who is going to turn this team around. That is a head coach who has already shown you her ceiling, and her ceiling is not good enough for the talent she has on this roster. And this is where the verdict becomes unavoidable. Stephanie White needs to be removed as head coach of the Indiana Fever. Not at the end of the season. Not after the All-Star break as some kind of symbolic gesture. Now, the situation has deteriorated past the point where any mid-season correction under this coaching staff is realistic. You have a head coach who is publicly undermining her franchise player. You have a head coach who has admitted at the podium that she has no additional defensive schemes to deploy. You have a head coach whose rotations are indefensible, whose halftime adjustments are non-existent, and whose post-game accountability consists entirely of pointing at Caitlin Clark's statistics. There is no version of this that gets better with more time. More time just means more losses, more blown leads, more podium deflections, and more of Caitlin Clark absorbing blame that belongs to the coaching staff. Let me tell you what the next news cycle looks like if nothing changes. The Fever lose another game they should have won. The lead disappears in the third quarter again, because nothing about the defensive scheme or the rotation strategy has changed. Caitlin Clark goes to the podium and takes responsibility for something that was not entirely her fault. Stephanie White goes to the podium and finds a way to frame the loss in terms of player execution rather than coaching decisions. And the cycle repeats. It has been repeating all season. It will keep repeating until the people who run this franchise make a decision. And let me be entirely clear about what that decision needs to be. This roster, even with its obvious construction flaws, has enough talent to compete if it is being coached properly. Caitlin Clark is a legitimate superstar when she is in attack mode, when she is getting downhill in transition, when the offense is flowing through her the way it was in the first half of this game. The Fever are a dangerous team. The problem is not the talent. The problem is the coaching framework that is actively suppressing that talent. The problem is a head coach who scolds her best player for scoring and then wonders why the offense stalls in the second half. The problem is a head coach who has no defensive adjustments and no accountability and no apparent awareness that the situation is as catastrophic as it is. The Indiana Fever front office needs to look at what is happening and understand that every game this continues is a game that damages Caitlin Clark's development, her confidence, her statistical narrative, and her relationship with this franchise. You do not get those games back. You do not get back the moments where a generational talent is being mentally broken down by the person who is supposed to be building her up. Those moments accumulate, they compound, and if this front office does not act, they are going to look up one day and realize they had the most exciting young player this league has seen in a decade, and they let a coaching situation poison the entire thing. Caitlin Clark right now is doing everything she can within a system that is working against her. She is scoring. She is finding open teammates. She is going to the podium and taking accountability that is not entirely hers to take. She is doing it with professionalism and composure that most players in her situation would not be able to maintain. And the only thing standing between Caitlin Clark and a genuinely dominant season is a head coach who cannot get out of her own way. That is the brutal, undeniable reality. That is the conversation TV refuses to have. And that is why we are having it here. Here is the question I want you to answer in the comments right now. And I want a real answer, not a diplomatic one. Do you believe Stephanie White should be fired before the All-Star break? Or do you think the Indiana Fever front office is going to wait until the end of the season and let this situation fully collapse first? Those are your two options, before the break or end of season. Drop it below. Make your case. This is Rimrun. If this video told you something the mainstream conversation is refusing to say, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell, because we are not done documenting what is happening in Indiana, and you do not want to miss what comes next.